always liked camping. There's something about the isolation, the peace that comes with being surrounded by nature, that made it one of my favorite things to do. The smell of pine in the air, the sound of crackling fires, and the feel of dirt beneath my boots. It all made me feel grounded. But what happened that summer, well, it changed the way I saw the outdoors. It wasn't the kind of story you tell by the campfire with a scary twist. No, it was real, raw, and it left me with a fear that still lingers. It all started with Brian. Brian was the guy at work who everyone knew. He was loud, always cracking jokes, and had this way of getting under your skin. Mostly in a good way, but sometimes it made you question your own sanity. Brian had a reputation among the newer guys. They'd all heard about the accident. And of course, his favorite story to tell was his own. He had lost part of his hand in a workplace accident. Not a minor injury either. He'd lost 2 fingers, his index and middle, and his hand was forever scarred from the incident. But what made it memorable wasn't just the injury itself. It was Brian's sense of humor about it. He would joke about how he couldn't wave at people anymore without them thinking he was flipping them off. He'd even turn it into a prank, showing off his missing fingers and then mimicking the motion of flipping someone off. He'd laugh it off, and everyone else would too, even though there was always a little tension hanging in the air when he did. His favorite part of the story was the one where he'd talk about how he would freak out new employees. He'd always make a big show of telling them to be careful, that accidents like his could happen at any time, and that they needed to be cautious. But after a few weeks, once the jokes got old, he'd always remind everyone that safety wasn't just about rules. It was about keeping your head in the game. A second of carelessness can cost you everything, he'd say with a grin, showing the stumps of his fingers. Still, even though he joked about it, we all knew that there was a grain of truth in his words. It was easy to dismiss, but deep down, everyone knew that what happened to Brian was no joke. I think that's why when he suggested we go camping together that summer, I agreed without a second thought. Brian had been pushing for a weekend camping trip for months. He'd promised it would be low-key, just a small group of us from work. Get some fresh air, clear your head, he'd said. No one really questioned it. I was looking forward to it myself. A weekend in the woods to escape from the grind. But things didn't go according to plan. We met up that Friday evening after work. The drive out to the campsite was long. Too long for me to enjoy the ride, especially after a stressful week. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. I could feel the air cooling quickly as we set up camp, and by the time the tents were up and the fire was going, it was already dark. It was an old, secluded site, the kind of place you don't see too many people around. The dirt was soft, the trees thick, and the silence that surrounded the area was almost unsettling. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone, even though you can't see anyone. First, the night was fun. We told stories around the fire, cracked open a few beers, and just let the stresses of the week slip away. It felt like a typical camping trip, and I was enjoying myself. But then, as the hours passed, there was a shift. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that screamed danger or fear. It was just a feeling, this growing unease that started to settle in my chest. Brian had been his usual self, cracking jokes and pranking the others, but there was something different about him that night. I couldn't place it at first, but as he walked around the campfire, keeping himself busy with small tasks, I noticed the way his eyes kept darting around. He seemed alert, like he was watching for something, and every time one of us made a joke or laughed too loudly, I'd catch him glancing nervously over his shoulder. It didn't take long for me to realize that he wasn't just making sure the fire was fed or keeping an eye on the surroundings. He was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely on edge. As the night wore on, I began to notice small, almost imperceptible sounds in the woods around us. The kind of things that could be easily dismissed. Branches snapping, the rustling of leaves, a distant animal call. But there was something off about it, something too deliberate. The night was still, too still, and each sound seemed to draw closer. My own skin started to crawl, a feeling of being watched creeping over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced over at Brian to find that he was staring into the trees, his face pale. I don't know how long I stayed awake, lying in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest. The fire had died down to embers, and the temperature had dropped, leaving the air cold against my skin. Sleep was difficult, even though I tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a scream. It wasn't a scream of panic or pain. It was a strange, drawn-out sound, almost like a howl. It seemed to echo through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and filling the air with an eerie resonance. My heart started racing. I couldn't tell where it had come from, but it sounded close. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, straining to listen. A few minutes passed, and the noise came again, but this time it was closer. It was like the forest had come alive, the woods pressing in around us. I heard movement outside my tent, quick, almost hurried steps, and then another scream, this time much more faint. I didn't think. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside, already feeling the chill of the night air hit my skin. Brian was already up, standing by the fire, looking into the woods. His face was grim, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He didn't need to say anything. I could see it in his eyes. He was just as spooked as I was. We weren't alone out there. For the next few hours, we stayed on high alert. Every small noise in the forest made us jump. We huddled around the fire, no one saying much, just watching the shadows in the trees, listening for anything that didn't belong. It was strange. It wasn't like the woods were alive with animals. There was no chirping of crickets, no hooting owls, no rustling of small creatures. It was dead silent, except for the occasional sound that seemed far too deliberate. By the time the sun started to rise, we were all exhausted, our nerves shot. It was only then that Brian spoke. He had this look on his face, a mixture of fear and something else. "It wasn't just the animals," he muttered half to himself. "We weren't alone." Later that day, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: footprints in the mud. They were large, but not like any animal tracks I knew. They were humanoid, with deep impressions that looked like they had been made by something walking on two legs. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something had been stalking us in the night. That was the last time I went camping with Brian. He never mentioned the incident again, but I could tell it had shaken him. We never spoke about it at work either, but I know he saw it. He'd lived through an accident that cost him his fingers, and yet this was something different. Something that made him realize that even in the places where we think we're safe, where we think we know what's out there, we really don't know anything at all. That weekend, I learned a lot about the woods, the feeling of being watched, the way the forest can make you feel so small, so insignificant, and how sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't make a sound, the ones that are just out of sight, waiting. I still go camping, but I'm never quite the same. When I hear the wind rustling in the trees, when I'm alone in the dark with nothing but the sounds of the forest around me, I can't shake the feeling that something is always watching. And I wonder if Brian ever feels it too. Maybe the woods don't forget. Maybe they just wait. I never thought something as simple as a camping trip could change my view on the world, but that weekend did. Looking back, it feels like one of those experiences you wish you could forget. Something that lingers in your mind, like a bad dream you can't shake off. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend. Just me and my friends, out in the woods, far from the bustle of everyday life. But instead, it turned into something else. We set up camp at a small, isolated spot by the edge of a creek. It was a place we'd found on a hiking map that seemed like the perfect getaway. Quiet, serene, untouched by the typical crowds that flood more popular spots. The woods felt different there, too, thick and dense. The trees stood like sentinels, towering above us as if they had seen centuries pass by. It was the kind of place where you could almost forget there was a world beyond it. The evening passed slowly at first. The fire crackled as we roasted marshmallows, our laughter filling the air. The day had been warm, and the night was cool but comfortable, a slight breeze stirring the leaves around us. We had a couple of beers, talked about everything and nothing, as we always did. The whole atmosphere was so calm. I almost felt like we were the only people left in the world. But there was something about that quietness, something that gnawed at the back of my mind, that didn't quite feel right. As night fell, Jesse, the one friend who seemed to love telling stories more than anyone else, began talking about something he had heard. A story that chilled me to the bone. He'd heard it from an old man at a campsite, somewhere deep in the same forest. A man who had seen strange things over the years. Jesse wasn't one to just tell any story. He liked ones that made you uncomfortable, made your skin crawl. "Have you ever heard about the missing fingers in these woods?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. The firelight flickered in his eyes, casting shadows on his face. None of us had. We all grew quiet. I figured it was just another one of his spooky campfire tales, but the intensity in his voice made me listen closely. Jesse began to explain that years ago, there were a series of strange deaths in this very part of the woods. The bodies always showed up in different locations, and they always had one thing in common: 3 fingers missing from the left hand. Not just any fingers, though: pointer, ring, and pinky. For some reason, no one ever understood why these particular fingers were being removed, and no one ever seemed to find the missing digits. It didn't end there. The police were baffled because the murders didn't seem to follow any pattern. The victims were all different. Men, women, children, all ages. But there was always the same brutal sign left behind: 3 fingers gone from the left hand. There was no struggle at the crime scene, and the victims didn't appear to have been robbed or harmed in any other way. It was almost like someone had just picked them, one by one, and taken what they needed. Jesse told us how the bodies started out with grown adults. The first person found was a large man in his late 40s or early 50s. His body was discovered deep in the woods, lying motionless, with the same pattern of missing fingers. The authorities had no idea what to make of it. But then, a few weeks later, another body turned up. A smaller man this time, maybe in his 30s, found in the same area, his left hand mutilated in the exact same way. And the cycle continued. The bodies started to get smaller, the victims younger. A woman, a teenager, then a child. Every time the body count grew, the method stayed the same: 3 fingers missing, and always from the left hand. No one knew who was doing it or why. As Jesse went on, his voice grew quieter. "Then they found a fingerprint," he said, staring into the fire. "It wasn't from any of the victims. It wasn't from any of the people around the crime scenes. It was from someone else. And they traced it back to a guy who had been arrested for a petty theft a while before." I had chills now. It seemed too surreal to be true. But Jesse wasn't done yet. This guy, he had been missing his ring and pinky fingers for years. There had been an accident, some work thing. The doctors saved what was left of his pointer finger, but the other 2, gone. And that's when they figured it out. He was trying to replace the fingers he'd lost. He was taking them from his victims. I stared at Jesse, disbelief settling in my stomach. A man cutting off fingers from random people, trying to replace his own. It sounded insane, but there was something in Jesse's eyes that made me think it was real. "The thing is," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "the man wasn't done." He kept going. But the real question was, why were the fingers so important to him? What was he going to do with them once he found the right match? By this point, I was on edge. My mind was racing. The sound of the wind through the trees seemed louder now, more oppressive. The thought of someone out there, in these very woods, searching for something that could replace his own lost fingers. It was disturbing. The idea that he might still be out there, hunting for more, made my skin crawl. Jesse finished the story with one final chilling detail. The last body they found was a boy, no older than 16. His body was found with only the ring and pinky finger missing. The police found a print there too, and it matched the one from the first murder. That's when they knew the guy had been going after the fingers he needed. And who knows, maybe the boy's fingers were the ones that fit. He paused for effect. The killer had to be close, but they never found him. Not then. Not now. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jesse was telling us something more. Maybe he knew more than he let on. But I wasn't sure. I didn't ask any questions. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the fire. The sounds of the woods seemed to grow louder, and my imagination began to run wild. Every rustle in the leaves felt like it was something else, something out there, watching, waiting. Later, as we lay in our tents, I kept hearing things outside. I wasn't sure if it was just the wind or something else, but every sound made my heart race. I kept my eyes on the zipper of my tent, expecting someone, on the other side. The fear was real, even though I knew I was probably just being paranoid. The next morning, we packed up quickly. No one spoke much about the story Jesse had told. We didn't need to. The weight of it hung in the air, unsaid. And as we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. There was something in the woods now, something that wasn't there before. It's been years since that camping trip, but I still think about it. And the more I think about it, the more I wonder, was Jesse telling us the truth, or was it just a story? I don't know. But when I go camping now, I always check my surroundings a little more carefully. And when I hear the crack of a twig behind me, I can't help but feel like someone might be out there, searching. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if he found what he was looking for. It was our second night at the camp. The fire was crackling softly, the smell of burnt wood mingling with the fresh air of the forest around us. I remember looking around the campfire at the faces of the kids sitting in front of me, their eager eyes wide as they waited for me to begin. I wasn't much older than them, maybe just a few years, but I'd been coming to this camp for as long as I could remember. I'd heard every campfire story you could think of, from ghost stories to myths about creatures lurking in the dark. But there was one story, the one I always told when the night felt right, that made the kids sit a little closer to the fire, that made their hearts race and the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. This was one of those nights. The air was thick, the shadows stretching longer than usual. You could almost feel the weight of the trees above us, their branches creaking gently in the breeze. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced around us. Everyone was quiet, waiting. I shifted my weight on the log, clearing my throat. This story, I said slowly, drawing the moment out, isn't something you hear around here all the time. It's something that stays with you, and it's not a story you forget easily. They leaned in a little, some of them already knowing that this was going to be different from the usual stories about mysterious sounds in the woods or campfire ghosts. This story had a way of making even the bravest of the group look over their shoulders. It all started, I told them, many years ago, so long ago that the old-timers still spoke of it in hushed voices around these very campfires. There was a body found deep in the woods one fall. It was a man, a fairly large guy from what I've been told. A camper, a hiker, or maybe even just someone passing through. No one really knew, and that was part of the mystery. When they found him, it wasn't as though the scene was filled with strange markings or anything that screamed suspicious. No one could figure out how he died. There were no cuts, no signs of a struggle. It was as though the man had simply dropped dead where he stood. But something was off about him, something no one could quite place. What they found next, though, was even stranger. The left hand was mangled, not from the force of anything, but from something deliberate. His left hand was missing half of the pointer, ring, and pinky fingers. Just gone. Not torn off, but cut cleanly, like someone had carefully removed them with a blade. There were no clues, no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. His body just appeared in the woods like that, without explanation. Weeks went by, people talked, and rumors spread, but it wasn't until the second body was found that anyone started to believe something was going on. This time, it was a man smaller than the first, but with the same strange wounds. 3 fingers gone. The pointer, ring, and pinky fingers, all from his left hand, removed as neatly as the first. The body was found in almost the same condition as the first one. No obvious signs of trauma, no struggle. Just a body in the woods. But the missing fingers? The same. Missing. Gone. And still, no one knew what was happening. No one had any idea what this meant. Weeks turned into months, and more bodies were found, each one a little smaller than the last. Men, women, children. They all seemed to share the same fate. Missing the 3 fingers from the left hand, cut cleanly, with no signs of violence beyond that. It became a pattern that the authorities couldn't ignore. No one could figure out why or how, or even if it was the same person responsible for these killings. It didn't make sense. There were no connections between the victims. Some were hikers, others were locals, a few were tourists. They came from all walks of life, yet they all shared that same grisly fate. Then came the discovery that made it all the more chilling. A teenager's body was found next, but this time there was something different. Only 2 fingers were missing, the ring and pinky fingers. And this time, the authorities found a clue that no one expected. A fingerprint. A clear, unmistakable fingerprint found on a nearby rock. The fingerprint matched a theft record from the second victim. It didn't take long for the police to make the connection. The same person responsible for the deaths was the one whose fingerprint had been found. The question was, why the fingers? Why take only certain ones? And what was he doing with them? No one knew, not until the kids in camp heard the full story. I paused for a moment, glancing around the fire at the kids who were listening so intently. Their faces were half lit by the fire, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and growing unease. The killer, I told them, wasn't just after random victims. He was looking for something. He was looking for something specific. For weeks, maybe even months, he had been taking fingers from victims, always the same fingers, half of the pointer, ring, and pinky of the left hand. There was only one reason a person would do that. He wasn't taking them as trophies. No, he needed them. He was trying to replace his own fingers. I stopped, letting that sink in. There were whispers among the kids, but I continued. The man had lost his fingers in a work accident years before, something so severe that his hand had been mangled beyond recognition. They managed to save his pointer finger, but the ring and pinky were beyond repair. The scars on his hand, I told them, were still visible even now. He wore gloves to hide it, but every year, without fail, he'd tell this story. He was trying to replace his fingers, one victim at a time. And so far, none of the fingers he had taken had been a perfect match. He was hoping that the fingers of children might fit. He was hoping that the smaller hands of younger victims might be the key. At that point, I took off my glove. The campfire crackled softly in the silence as I revealed my own hand. My pointer finger, still mangled from the accident. And the ring and pinky fingers, gone, half of each missing, just like the victims. My hand was a scarred, misshapen thing, the result of a horrible accident that had changed everything. I paused for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. The night felt colder now, and the wind howled through the trees. The fire seemed to flicker and wane. I took a step toward them, eyes wide, and then I lunged at them with a scream, the image of the killer's desperation, his hunger for those missing fingers, flashing in my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the moment passed. I stopped, breathing hard, my chest heaving. The kids jumped back, gasping, some of them even scrambling to their feet. The fire crackled louder than ever. I smiled, wiping my brow, but I wasn't smiling in amusement. I wasn't laughing. I just stood there, breathing heavily, looking at their wide eyes. That, I said quietly, is the story of the finger killer. And remember, I never found the missing fingers either. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, but it wasn't just the silence of the night. It was the kind of silence you feel when you know something darker is out there, something that doesn't belong in the world of firelight and camp songs. The story always ended like that, always, but it wasn't just a story anymore. Not to me, not to anyone who had ever heard it. It was real. The kids would never forget it, and neither would I. It was the kind of camping trip that seemed innocent enough. I'd planned everything down to the smallest detail. Tents, sleeping bags, firewood, food. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, me, a couple of friends, and sometimes spent far away from work, the city, and all the noise that had been building up in my life for the past few months. The spot was perfect, a remote patch of forest nestled in the foothills, far off the usual hiking trails and camping spots. I was eager for the peace, the solitude of nature, the kind of peace that only comes when you're surrounded by trees and the distant sound of running water. The campsite was a quiet, small clearing, just big enough for our tents and the fire. The trees around us were tall and old, their thick trunks seeming to rise out of the earth like silent guardians. Everything felt right, or at least it did at first. We arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. We set up camp quickly, laughing and joking as we worked. It was almost too perfect. We cooked our dinner over the fire, the smell of grilled meat and the crackle of the wood in the flames adding to the ambience. But as the night went on, the atmosphere slowly shifted. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling like a heaviness in the air. We were sitting around the fire, talking about nothing in particular, when I first noticed it. The silence. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet you expect in the woods, where you hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an animal. No, this was different. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. Even the usual sounds of the wind moving through the trees had stopped. The only noise that broke the silence was the soft crackling of the fire. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I brushed it off at first. Maybe it was just the usual nervousness that comes with being in a remote place, far from civilization. But as the night wore on, it only got worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The others seemed oblivious, lost in their own thoughts or conversations, but I couldn't ignore it. Every time I looked around, the trees felt closer. The shadows between them seemed darker, deeper. We went to bed around midnight, the fire having burned down to nothing more than a pile of glowing embers. The air had cooled and the wind had started to pick up again, but it still felt wrong, unnaturally so. The sounds of the forest had returned, but they were muted, distant, as if something was pressing down on the world around us. I lay in my tent, my sleeping bag wrapped tightly around me, trying to push the uneasy feeling from my mind, but it wouldn't go away. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something that wasn't quite right. A faint rustle, a snap of a twig, the sound of something moving in the darkness. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the more I listened, the more it felt like whatever was out there was aware of us, watching us. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Around 2 a.m., I heard my friend Tom's voice from the tent next to mine. He was whispering, but his voice was tense, edged with fear. "You guys hear that?" he asked. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. But then I realized that I wasn't the only one who was awake. Slowly, the other voices joined in, murmuring from their tents, asking the same question. "I hear it," said Sarah. "It's like something's moving out there." "Yeah, it's probably just a deer or something," I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they didn't sound convincing. There was another rustle. This time it was louder, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My breath caught in my throat. "I don't think that's a deer," I said quietly, sitting up in my tent. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembling slightly. "Whatever it is, it's too big." Tom didn't respond, but I could hear him shifting in his tent. A few moments later, I heard the sound of zippers as everyone began to emerge from their tents. The air felt thick, as if the whole forest was holding its breath again. We all stood there in the middle of the clearing, the fire long gone and the night dark as pitch. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving us with nothing but the beam of flashlights and the eerie silence of the forest around us. "Maybe we should just pack up," Sarah suggested. "It's not worth it. I don't feel safe here." I didn't blame her for saying that. I wasn't sure I felt safe either, but something in me made me hold back from agreeing. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I just didn't want to appear scared. Whatever it was, I stayed quiet. We stood there for a few more minutes, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then there it was again, the rustle, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. The shadows between the trees shifted, as if something was watching us from just out of sight. "I think it's time to go," Tom finally said, his voice strained. That was all the convincing I needed. Without another word, we began to pack up our things. The rustling continued, growing closer with each passing second, as if something was circling us, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurriedly shoved my gear into my bag. But just as we were about to leave, the unmistakable snap of a twig echoed from the trees to our left. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. We all turned to face the sound. Something was out there. It was then that I realized just how much I had underestimated how far off the beaten path we had really gone. There were no other campers, no rangers, no one else for miles around. We were alone. The rustling got louder, closer, and then it stopped. Completely. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It felt like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the flashlight beams. I motioned for everyone to stay quiet. We all stood there, frozen, as the shadows around us seemed to deepen. The sense of being watched was overwhelming now. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Every instinct I had told me to run. And then, in the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees. A sound so deep, so primal, it made my stomach twist in fear. "Go," I whispered. "We need to go now." We didn't waste time. We grabbed what we could, abandoning the tents and the gear that wasn't essential. We ran. The growl came again, this time closer, louder. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something else, something far more terrifying. I've never been a fast runner, but that night, with the adrenaline pumping through my veins, I pushed myself harder than I ever thought possible. The trees flew past me, the ground uneven and treacherous underfoot. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Out of breath, heart racing, we threw ourselves into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The fear was written on all our faces. As we drove away, I looked back toward the dark outline of the forest, the headlights cutting through the trees, revealing nothing but shadow. That was the last time I ever camped in that spot. Whatever it was that watched us that night, I hope it stays there, lost to the trees, hidden in the depths of the forest. We left, but I don't think any of us ever really felt safe again. It was more than 50 years ago, but I still remember it clearly. We were a group of middle school kids on a school camping trip, headed to Shenandoah National Park. It was supposed to be a learning experience, a chance to get out of the classroom and into the woods, to learn about the outdoors, about nature, about ourselves. None of us had any idea we'd be learning how real fear felt, or how fast people can move when that fear kicks in. The trip had started off fine. We were young, restless, and easily impressed. The teachers were trying to corral us into some kind of order. But there's only so much order you can expect with a couple dozen kids crammed into a bus with gear piled high and food packed in big coolers. We pulled into the campsite around mid-morning, and after some general chaos and bickering over tents and who was bunking with who, we settled in. The campground wasn't especially remote, but back then, everything felt remote. There were woods on all sides, dirt paths, outhouses. You could hear the birds, the wind through the trees. It felt like wilderness to us. The chaperones and teachers had us split into groups for activities. Some were in charge of setting up tents, others started working on a cooking area, and another group, which I was part of, had to haul the food and supplies out of the bus and into a central storage area near the fire ring. The park had warned us about bears. There were pamphlets and signs all over, but it felt like a warning from another world. None of us had actually seen a bear before, and they seemed more like legends than a real concern. We stacked everything carefully. There was a heavy-duty trash can set up by the adults, who had insisted it would keep out any critters. But the truth was, our group didn't take the warnings seriously. Some of the older kids, especially the ones who thought they were tough, joked about bears being overgrown raccoons. I think that sort of confidence can only come from someone who's never felt vulnerable out in the woods. That first night, things went fine. Some of us stayed up late talking, swapping stories, teasing each other. I remember it being chilly, not cold, but enough to make you pull the zipper up on your sleeping bag and turn onto your side to block the wind. I fell asleep with the sound of branches creaking above me and the quiet hum of others shifting in their tents. The trouble started the second day. In the early morning, when the sun was just starting to stretch over the treetops, I got up to help bring out breakfast supplies from the storage area. The adults were already up, getting coffee ready, and a few of us sleepy kids were dragging our feet over to the coolers. That's when we saw it. The trash can, that big, supposedly bear-resistant metal can, was bent. Not just tipped over, but actually deformed. It looked like someone had kicked it with a car. There was a big dent where something had stepped or maybe pressed down hard. The lid had been knocked clean off and lay several feet away. The inside of the can was shredded, garbage everywhere. Torn food packaging, empty cans, and a ripped plastic container of bread were scattered around like confetti. But what really stopped us cold was the can of fruit cocktail. A big industrial-sized thing like you'd get from a restaurant supplier. The kind that weighs 5 or 6 pounds. It hadn't been opened, but it was dented and marked. Actual teeth marks. Deep grooves in the metal where something big had tried to bite into it. You could see the indentations clearly. And nearby, a few huge claw marks were gouged into one of the coolers. Whatever had been there had serious power. The adults started to panic a little then. You could see it in how they moved, in how their voices got quieter. They didn't want to scare us, but they also knew this wasn't a raccoon or some stray dog. They had us help clean up while they moved anything else with a smell far from the tents and stacked it up near the bus. Some of them muttered about sleeping on the bus that night. A few of us laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But as the sun went down, you could feel a tension over the camp. Most of us kids stayed in our tents, but I remember peeking out and seeing some of the adults sitting around the fire with flashlights in their laps and metal pots nearby to bang if they heard anything. It didn't feel like a field trip anymore. It felt like we were waiting for something. That night, 5 or 6 of us were allowed to sleep on the bus. I got one of the window seats toward the back. It felt safe, warmer. The kind of comfort you get from doors that close and glass between you and whatever might be out there. I fell asleep for a bit, but I remember waking up just past midnight, heart thumping. At first I didn't know why, then I heard something. A crashing sound, distant but clear. Then yelling, not terrified yelling, but that chaotic, confused kind of yelling that happens when people are startled. I pressed my face to the window, and I could barely see anything beyond the first line of trees, but the noise carried. Shouts, something slamming, and then a group of people running. Fast. It was the camp just over the ridge. We hadn't paid much attention to them when we arrived, just noticed a few other tents and some other students about our age. Now we saw them bolting out of their tents, some in pajamas, some barefoot. A few ran right into the bathhouse buildings. I saw men diving into the women's side and women going into the men's. No one cared about that. They just wanted to be somewhere solid. Somewhere with walls. The bear, we saw it a few seconds later. Came out slow, lumbering, not in a rush. Huge. It was a dark blur at first, but the way it moved told us exactly what it was. It didn't seem angry, just determined. Like it knew what it was doing. It sniffed around the site, then walked off into the trees. The noise died down after that. The adults who were still up kept watch the rest of the night. We left the next morning. Not just us, the other group too. The teachers called in extra buses. We didn't even eat breakfast there. Everyone packed up in a kind of quiet panic, trying not to act like they were rushing but clearly ready to be gone. That bus ride home was long, quiet. I don't think I was the only one watching the woods out the window the whole time. Even now, 50 years later, I remember the feeling of looking at that crushed trash can, of seeing teeth marks in solid metal, of hearing the panic from the next site over. It changed how I looked at nature. Not in a bad way. I still go hiking, still camp, but I never leave food unsecured. I don't take shortcuts, and I always remember that even if you think you're prepared, you might not be, because sometimes the bear comes anyway. I camped at Big Meadow last fall, late in the season when most folks had cleared out for the year. The air was crisp but not freezing. The trees had already let go of most of their leaves, and the evenings dropped into that kind of silence that presses into your ears. It was exactly what I wanted. I needed quiet, solitude, space to breathe. I had been dealing with too much noise back home, too many people, and not enough space. I hiked in from the trailhead just after lunch. It was about a 6-mile hike with a steady climb and a few small creek crossings, but nothing hard. I'd done the route before, so I knew the terrain and where the established sites were. Big Meadow sits in a wide, open basin surrounded by a low tree line, and it really lives up to its name. Grasses and sedges blanket the space, and in the evening light, it turns this deep golden color that makes everything feel calm. When I reached the site, the sun was just starting to dip a little. I picked a spot tucked close to the trees on the northern edge of the meadow. It offered some wind protection and gave me a clear view across the grass in case anything wandered through. The ground was mostly flat, dry, and free of big rocks. I set up my one-person tent quickly, staked it well, and packed in extra dirt around the edges to keep the cold air from sweeping underneath. I had a decent system for food and gear. My pack had a food storage compartment that I hung from a sturdy branch on a nearby tree, well away from the tent. I wrapped it in a tarp and ratchet strapped it to make sure it stayed dry and sealed. For bears and other wildlife, I wasn't taking chances. The only thing I kept outside the food bag was my toilet paper and trowel, which I kept in a plastic bag tied near the bottom of the tree for easy access if I had to go during the night. I always kept my flashlight on me. I didn't like rooting around in the dark. Dinner was simple, rehydrated chili and some trail mix. I boiled water, watched the sunset paint the meadow in reds and oranges, and listened to the quiet. The kind of quiet you only get in the backcountry. The kind that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. When the light started to disappear completely, I cleaned up, packed away my food, brushed my teeth, and made one last walk a little way off into the brush to take care of business. Then I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the dark. That first hour in the tent is always strange. Your ears are on high alert. Every snap of a twig or whisper of grass can sound louder than it really is. I told myself what I always do. Let your body settle. Don't react to every noise. Most things are small animals, the wind, or your own mind. I turned off the flashlight, rolled onto my side, and tried to let sleep pull me under. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. A soft rustle, a faint brushing noise, like something moving slowly through tall grass. I held my breath and listened. It came again. A deliberate movement, steady and unhurried. Then it was closer, just outside the tent, to my left. The first thing your mind does is race. You play every possibility. Deer, bear, coyote, person. But I'd seen no other humans on the trail and didn't expect any. That left animals. There was a brushing sound, like fur or hide nudging against nylon. It made the tent wall flex inward slightly. Not a full press, just a nudge. I could hear the breath now, heavy and short. Not like a deer's panicked huff, but something more consistent. For a split second, my brain said, bear. But then I remembered the deer. Big Meadow was known for them. They came into the open space at night, often unafraid of tents. Campers had talked about it before. They'd nose around, sniff at unfamiliar objects, sometimes even bump a tent out of curiosity. I told myself that was what this was. A deer, another rustle, the sound of something stepping lightly, for legs, delicate and sure. Another bump against the tent, this time near my feet. I stayed perfectly still, eyes wide open in the pitch dark, heart hammering in my chest. What if it wasn't a deer? What if that food bag hadn't been high enough? What if some scent from dinner had lingered on my clothes? I kept my hands still, even though my flashlight was in my pocket. I didn't want to make a sudden move, didn't want to spook whatever it was and invite a worse response. If it was a deer, it would wander off. If it was a bear, movement might only make it worse. A soft snort, then the unmistakable sound of hooves stepping back. That had to be a deer. I let out a slow breath and tried to calm myself down. The brush noises moved further from the tent, looping around, then pausing again. I imagined a curious doe sniffing the shovel bag or the tree. Eventually, the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight in my hand, clicking it on and off a few times to check the inside of the tent, just for reassurance. Nothing touched the tent again. By the time morning started to filter in through the thin walls, my eyes were sore and my head buzzed with fatigue. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold and still. Dew clung to the grass, and the light was a pale blue. I walked over to where the food bag was strapped up. Still there, untouched. The plastic bag with the toilet paper had been nudged a few feet, the edge of it scuffed with a few light dirt marks. Hoof prints dotted the soft soil nearby. Definitely deer. That should have comforted me more than it did. But it didn't, because now I had a better understanding of just how vulnerable I really was out there. Alone, zipped into a nylon sack, completely still while some large animal walked around me, pressed its face near my body, and I couldn't do anything about it. I made oatmeal and coffee, slowly repacking my gear as the sun rose higher. I stayed one more night because I didn't want to leave under pressure. But I moved my tent a little deeper into the trees. Less meadow view, but I wanted some buffer between me and that open space. That second night was quieter, but I barely slept. I never saw the deer. I only heard them, felt them through the thin wall of my tent, imagined their big dark eyes and twitching ears inches from my face. I imagined a scenario where it hadn't been a deer, where something more dangerous had taken interest. That trip taught me more about fear than any loud noise or storm ever had. Fear wasn't a roar or a scream. It was the silence that follows a brush of fur against your tent. It was the decision to stay still. It was telling yourself it was just a deer, because the truth, if it was something else, meant you were helpless. I still camp, still go out into the woods alone, but I pack differently now. I choose sites with more cover, always check for game trails, and tie a small noisemaker to the outside of the tent. Something simple that might give me a few seconds of warning. I don't sleep as easily, but I still go. Because even if the night pushes close and the deer press their noses to the thin wall of your world, there's something honest about knowing exactly how close danger can get, and still waking up in the morning. I've always been careful about how I camp. I do things by the book, not because I'm scared of the woods, but because I respect them. I know what can go wrong out there. I've done enough backcountry camping to understand how small mistakes build up and turn into disasters. So when I set out on a solo weekend trip into the northern stretch of state forest last fall, I packed with care, planned my route, and followed every rule I usually do. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, flat, quiet, off a narrow spur trail that split from the main loop around mile 9. There's no cell service back there, which is one of the reasons I like it. It forces me to pay attention, to stay sharp. It also means I have to be completely self-reliant. No one's gonna come running if I twist an ankle or get turned around. So I packed light but thorough: tent, sleeping bag, rain fly, small pot, food bag, water filter, basic med kit. My bear bag went in its usual dry sack, tied off with cord, strapped to a tree maybe 30 yards from camp. I threw a camo tarp over it, and because I like to be prepared, I ratchet strapped it tight to the trunk to stop anything from knocking it loose. I hung it shoulder height so I wouldn't have to lift it overhead. Not the most standard bear hang, but this was a low-risk area, and I found it works well enough. The bag with my toilet paper and trowel always stays out. I keep it outside the tent but within reach. I never want to dig through my gear in the dark when nature calls. It's just a plastic grocery bag with a zip-top sandwich bag inside for the paper. I stuff the trowel handle down in the dirt next to it. Flashlight stays on me, always clipped to my waistband, even while sleeping. I've never had to use it in an emergency, but it's there for a reason. The first night was calm. The woods were silent in that particular way they get in the fall, empty, windless, dry. It was colder than I expected once the sun went down. I cooked a small dinner, filtered water, zipped into my bag early. The stars were out in full force. The air smelled clean. I drifted off thinking about nothing. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I wasn't cold. I wasn't uncomfortable. I didn't need to piss. But something had clicked my brain on like a switch. I lay still for a minute, breathing slowly, listening. There was no sound outside the tent, not even wind in the trees. I always expect some rustling. Raccoons, birds shifting on branches, sometimes deer. But this was total silence. I stayed still for another minute, maybe longer, just waiting. Then I heard it. A sharp snap of twigs off to the right. Farther than where my food bag was tied. Maybe 30 or 40 feet away. Then nothing. Then another step closer this time. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight, switched it on without pointing it yet. I don't panic easily. I've dealt with black bears before. They move around at night, and they usually don't stick around if they know you're awake. But the thing was, this didn't sound like a bear. Bears make noise. They huff, they grunt, they step heavy, and you hear the shuffle of their fur. This sounded different, sharp, like deliberate human steps, careful steps. One pause, then another, then stillness. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it toward the noise through the mesh of my tent. Just trees, just darkness. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't want to give whatever it was a clearer view of me. I waited. 5 minutes went by, then 10. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep. I dozed on and off, always listening. I kept the flashlight on low in my hand, and I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a porcupine or coyote nosing around. I didn't hear anything for the rest of the night. By morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. I made coffee, shook off the nerves, and walked over to check the food bag. It hadn't been touched. The ratchet straps were tight. No claw marks or signs of disturbance. Nothing missing. My shovel and teepee bag were exactly where I left them. I hiked a few miles out and did some fishing in a nearby creek. It helped calm me down. The whole day passed quietly, and when I made dinner and got back into my tent that night, I felt like maybe I'd been over alert. It happens sometimes. Sleep in the woods, your brain doesn't fully turn off. That second night, I fell asleep faster. It was colder, but I'd bundled up and cinched the bag tight around my shoulders. I drifted out and didn't wake again until well after midnight. This time, it was a sound much closer that pulled me out of sleep. Plastic crinkle, like right outside the tent. I froze. My eyes were wide open in the dark, and I knew exactly what the sound was. It was my toilet paper bag. Another faint noise, a soft tap, like something brushing against the tent wall near my feet. Then silence. I didn't move. My heart was racing now. This wasn't an animal nosing around for scraps. There was nothing edible in that bag, just TP and a trowel. Something had taken interest in it anyway. I waited a full minute, then slowly reached for my flashlight and turned it on. I flicked it toward the foot of the tent. The beam lit up the fabric, but nothing moved outside. I debated unzipping the flap. I didn't want to, but I couldn't just lie there either. Slowly, I reached forward, unzipped the mesh, then the outer fly, just enough to poke the flashlight through. I clicked it to the higher beam and swung it toward where the teepee bag had been. It was gone. The bag was gone, and so was the trowel. Nothing else disturbed, just those two things. My stomach clenched, and I pulled the light in, zipped up, and sat there in the dark for a while, thinking, what would take a toilet paper bag? An animal might chew on a wrapper, maybe, but they wouldn't take the whole thing. And not the shovel. That was a small steel camp trowel with a bright orange handle. It didn't even smell like anything. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay in the bag with the flashlight resting across my chest, ears on high alert. Nothing else moved. Nothing made noise. At first light, I unzipped the tent and walked slowly around the area. I found tracks, several of them, just impressions in the leaves and damp dirt. They were boot prints, not mine, not my tread pattern. They came from the north side of the site, stopped near where the teepee bag had been, then walked off west into the brush. That made my decision easy. I broke camp fast. I didn't even bother making coffee or breakfast. I threw everything in my pack, left the tarp on the food bag, grabbed just what I needed, and headed straight for the main loop trail. Once I got to it, I didn't stop. I covered 9 miles in under 3 hours and didn't breathe easy until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. Even then, I kept looking over my shoulder. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone came through my camp. Someone came close enough to the tent to reach for the bag right outside. And they didn't take food. They didn't try to steal my gear. They took toilet paper and a trowel, items meant for privacy, for vulnerability. That's what got me. It wasn't about theft. It wasn't an animal or someone scavenging. It was about messing with me. It was about control. and that's what's stuck in my head ever since. I still camp. I still go out alone sometimes, but now I double up. I hide the shovel. I don't leave anything outside the tent, and I carry something heavier than a flashlight clipped to my belt. I don't sleep as well out there anymore, but that's the price you pay once someone shows you how real danger hides in the small things. The bag you barely think about, the sound outside your tent, the part of your gear you never expected anyone else would touch. I still have no idea who it was. I never found the bag or the trowel. I never heard from anyone else who had a similar experience in that area. But I know what happened, and I've learned that in the backcountry, it's not just the big things that get you. It's what you don't expect. And now I always expect it. I've always liked camping, but I never thought I'd find myself laying in a cold tent, curled up in my sleeping bag, wide awake at 2:30 in the morning trying not to shit myself. That night taught me something. A few things, really. First, dispersed camping, meaning no bathrooms, no water, no nothing, is a whole different beast than going to a maintained campsite. Second, and more importantly, dig your hole before bed, even if you don't think you'll need it. The whole thing started earlier in the week. My girlfriend and I had decided to get away from the city for a long weekend. She was the one who suggested dispersed camping, said it would be peaceful, less crowded, more connected with nature. I agreed. I liked the idea of not dealing with packed campgrounds and screaming kids, just the two of us and the woods. We packed up the car Thursday night and left early Friday morning. The drive was uneventful, maybe 3.5 hours out to a national forest that allowed dispersed camping. It was mid-autumn, which meant we'd get chilly nights but not full-on snow yet. Still, temperatures were dipping down into the low 30s at night. Cold enough that you felt it, especially if you had to get up to pee or worse. We got to the forest late afternoon and spent some time looking for a decent spot. With dispersed camping, there are no set sites. You drive down forest roads and find a flat, quiet place that's far enough from water sources and trails. We found a good clearing just off a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been driven in weeks. Plenty of tree cover, a flat patch for the tent, and a good view of the valley if you stepped a few yards east. Perfect. We pitched the tent, rolled out the sleeping pads and bags, got a fire going, and cooked some dinner. I think it was canned chili and some roasted hot dogs. We hadn't eaten much on the drive out, so we both went a little heavy. We also had a couple beers each, trying to get into that relaxed, we're away from it all kind of mindset. I wasn't really thinking about what that chili and beer combo might do to my stomach at 2 a.m., but I should have. The first night was windy. The tent flapped like crazy, and every gust made the trees groan. The wind cut right through the nylon walls, and the cold crept in through the ground. Even inside my sleeping bag, fully zipped and wearing wool socks and thermals, I couldn't get totally warm. I drifted in and out of light sleep, waking up every hour or so. The fire was out, of course, and the night had that dead silence between wind gusts that makes every little crack in the woods sound like it's 2 feet from your head. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up with this heavy feeling in my gut. Not just discomfort, full-on cramping. That unmistakable pressure that says, you're not going back to sleep until you handle this. I tried to ignore it, curled up tighter, hoped it would pass. Didn't. It hit me again, worse this time, and I knew I had maybe 2 minutes to do something about it, or I was going to have a real problem in a very confined space. I couldn't risk waking her up with an accident like that. I had to go. Now here's the thing, we hadn't dug a hole earlier. I'd thought about it while we were setting up, but with everything going on, firewood, cooking, trying to find the lighter we kept misplacing, I never followed through. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was not having a marked spot ready, because now I was in a full-on emergency in the middle of the freezing dark, with no hole, no light, and no plan. I slipped out of the sleeping bag, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and stepped into the cold. It hit me like a wall. The air was icy, and the wind was still blowing, though not quite as strong as earlier. My teeth started chattering immediately, and the cramps doubled down like my guts knew I was out of options. I grabbed the little LED headlamp from the gear bag and started shuffling around for a place to go. We kept a small folding shovel in one of the plastic storage totes with the other gear, and I figured I could dig fast, take care of business, and be back in the tent in 5 minutes. Of course, when I got to the crate, I realized we'd packed the gear in a rush and hadn't done any sort of organization. There were fuel canisters, propane, extra stakes, tarps, and tools all crammed in there, but no shovel on top. I started tossing things out onto the pine needles, checking under each item like I was on a game show and time was running out. My stomach was on the verge of mutiny, and I was sweating even though I was freezing. I finally found what looked like a little plastic trowel wedged between a tarp and the stove. It was tiny, cheap-looking, barely the size of my hand, and felt like it would snap if I leaned on it. But it was all I had. I ran a few feet from camp, found a spot that looked soft enough under a tree, and dropped to my knees. The ground was cold and hard. The dirt was dry, full of rocks and roots. That trowel was useless. I scratched maybe an inch into the ground before I realized I wasn't going to get anything deep enough. Panicked, my stomach gave me one final warning, and I gave up on the trowel entirely. I started clawing at the dirt with my hands, trying to dig at least a shallow hole. My fingers scraped against roots, my knuckles hit rocks, and I could barely see what I was doing. By the time I'd carved out enough of a depression to feel like I could go without completely violating every leave no trace rule I cared about, it was almost too late. I barely got my shorts down in time. I won't get into the full picture, but let's just say it wasn't clean, it wasn't graceful, and it definitely wasn't fully contained. The cold air didn't help. My legs were shaking, and I was bent over like a lunatic, swearing to myself in the dark. When it was finally over, I reached for the toilet paper, only to remember I hadn't brought it. It was back in the tent in the little hygiene bag. That moment was pure defeat. I stared at my hand, dirty from digging, and realized it was the only option I had. I wiped as best I could with dirt and pine needles, then scooped some of the dry soil over the hole and did a half-hearted job covering it. My hands were filthy, my shorts were ruined, and I still had to clean up. I went back to the edge of camp and grabbed one of the water jugs we brought for washing. I crouched behind a log, poured ice-cold water over my ass, scrubbed with what was left of my dignity, and tried not to scream from the cold. It was miserable. When I finally got back in the tent, I used baby wipes from our kit to clean my hands and arms, tossed my shorts into a trash bag, and climbed back into the sleeping bag with every layer I could find. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came slowly. The sun crept over the trees, and everything was quiet. My girlfriend woke up feeling refreshed, while I looked like I'd spent the night being interrogated by nature. I told her what happened, and she pointed out that the real collapsible shovel, our decent one with the metal handle and fold-out spade, had been inside a pouch I'd tossed aside during my panic. I'd been too flustered to check the whole crate carefully. I'd used the backup plastic trowel, the one we only kept for emergencies. That day, I dug a proper cat hole before lunch, deep enough, well away from camp, and clearly marked with a stick sticking out at an angle. I even laid a few rocks around the edge so it would be visible in low light. I did the same before bed that night, just in case. That night was better. I still didn't sleep great. My body was sore, and the embarrassment of it all kept replaying in my mind, but at least I didn't wake up having to sprint into the woods with my pants around my knees. Looking back, it was stupid. I should have prepared better. Digging a hole before bed might seem like overkill, but when you're out in the woods with no toilet, it's smart. The cold doesn't care about your dignity. When nature calls in the middle of the night, you don't want to be scrambling with a plastic toy and a ticking clock. Next time we go camping, I'll be ready. I'll dig the hole first thing, mark it clearly, and maybe even bring a second shovel just in case. I'll keep the toilet paper in a Ziploc in the vestibule and bring extra wipes. Lesson learned. Camping's still worth it. The stars, the silence, the crackling fire. It's all amazing. But I've got a new respect for the basics now. In the wild, small mistakes become big problems fast. And sometimes, surviving the night means more than just staying warm or safe from animals. Sometimes it means planning ahead for the most human parts of being human. Because out there, there's no bathroom, just dirt, cold air, and the hope that you've thought ahead. Dispersed camping wasn't something I did all the time, but it wasn't new to me either. I liked the isolation, the quiet, the total break from everything artificial. No crowds, no campsite fees, no kids on scooters, no RVs humming all night. Just wilderness. And the rules were simple. Pack in, pack out, bury your waste, keep a respectful distance from water sources. I'd done it before, I'd do it again. That was the idea. This trip wasn't planned months ahead or anything. Came together fast, a window of free time and decent weather, so we went for it. Just me and my girlfriend, her little dog, a decent forecast, and a Forest Service map with a couple of promising spots circled. We threw gear together, checked our lists, and hit the road late Friday morning. By the time we made it to the turnoff and found a dirt road that led deep enough into the trees to feel away from everything, it was almost evening. The sun was low, casting gold through the trees and lighting up the dust kicked by our tires. The road was rough but manageable, and after bouncing through washouts and dips for about a mile and a half, we found a little pull-off wide enough for the car and a flat space nearby for the tent. No one else around. Just wind in the trees and the feeling of being completely out there. We got to work fast. She handled the dog and started sorting gear while I set up the tent. It was one of those early spring weekends where the days are warm enough but the nights still drop below freezing, especially this far north and this high up. The wind was already picking up, and I could feel the chill seeping in. Layers went on quick. We got the tent pitched, the sleeping pads inflated, and the bags unrolled. She started a small fire while I hauled water from a nearby creek. It was clear, ice cold, and moving just enough to be usable. We filtered some, boiled a bit for hot drinks, and settled in as the last light faded behind the ridge. Dinner was simple, dehydrated camp meals and some instant hot cocoa. We sat near the fire, bundled in layers, talking a little and just listening to the forest settle into night. After an hour or two, the wind got sharper and the fire started to feel like a wall between us and the cold. When we finally turned in, it was already dipping into the low 30s. We zipped up inside the tent, layered in thermals, and huddled into our bags. The wind buffeted the tent all night. The fly flapped constantly, and every now and then a strong gust would make the whole thing ripple like a sheet in a storm. I woke up a few times just from the noise and the cold. My nose felt like a block of ice outside the sleeping bag, and my breath turned the inside of the tent damp and clammy. I kept trying to turn over without unzipping the bag all the way, trying to find a comfortable position and hold on to what little warmth I had. Then, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, my stomach flipped. It didn't start small. There was no warning, just that tight, internal cramp that drops like a lead weight. I opened my eyes and knew instantly I wasn't going to be able to wait until morning. I didn't have the luxury of pretending it might pass. It hit full force, that unmistakable feeling of emergency. Pressure, heat, nausea, all tangled together. My body was ready to explode. I scrambled to sit up inside the bag, fumbling for my headlamp and trying to unzip the side of the tent with stiff fingers. The wind outside was worse now, and I could hear the trees creaking. My face stung the second I stuck it outside the flap. I crouched there in the cold for a second, trying to remember where she packed the shovel. My mind was fuzzy from waking up like that, but I remembered she said something before the trip about getting a new shovel. She had packed it herself. Said it was in one of the crates in the trunk. That was all I had to go on. I darted over to the car barefoot in unlaced boots, my stomach wrenching again, and yanked open the hatch. The cold air tore into me, and the wind felt like it could cut through my jacket. I threw aside bags and bins, opening one crate after another. My hands were shaking and clumsy. I was already sweating from panic and cold at the same time, and the pressure in my gut was ratcheting up by the second. I was at the edge, one wrong move, one more second wasted, and I was going to lose it. When I finally found the shovel, it wasn't what I expected. I was looking for a normal little camping trowel, plastic or maybe lightweight metal. But what I found was some odd multi-tool contraption. It had a jagged edge, screws holding it together, and parts that folded out. It looked more like something you'd break into a bunker with than dig a hole. Cold metal, awkward grip, and dull as hell. This was what she'd packed? I didn't have time to think. I grabbed it, slammed the hatch shut, and ran back into the trees. I just needed to get far enough from camp and from the creek. That was the rule, 200 feet from any water source, away from trails and camp areas. I picked a direction and ran, feet slipping on rocks and cold dirt, brush slapping against my legs. I got maybe 100 feet in before I knew I had to stop. I knelt down and started digging with the shovel. The ground was hard, not frozen solid, but close enough. Layers of dry needles and topsoil gave way to compacted dirt that felt like concrete. I pushed and twisted, but the jagged blade bounced off roots and rocks. It didn't dig so much as scratch the surface. I was desperate. I got maybe 2 inches down before my hands went numb and my stomach clenched again so hard I nearly blacked out. I dropped to my knees and started using my hands. Cold, hard-packed soil filled my nails and froze my fingers. I scraped and pulled and clawed. The wind was so loud it sounded like it was inside my skull. My whole body was shaking from cold and strain. I got the hole deep enough. Barely. I yanked down my shorts and did what I had to do. It happened fast. Violent. It wasn't just a normal bowel movement, it was full-blown, body-emptying disaster. It splattered the edge of the hole and my own legs, and I felt everything inside me just give out. I stayed crouched, shaking, trying not to vomit, staring at the dirt and my breath fogging in the beam of my headlamp. Then I realized I'd forgotten the toilet paper. There was no going back. I looked around. Nothing but rocks and frozen brush. My fingers were caked in dirt and shit from digging. I tried to wipe with the back of my hand, then used the dirt itself. I scooped some and did my best, grit grinding into skin. I didn't care. I just wanted it over. When I was done, I covered the mess with what little loose dirt I had, pressing it down with a rock. It wasn't deep enough, not really, but I had no choice. I pulled up my shorts, shivering so hard my teeth were knocking. My legs were filthy. My hand was worse. The smell was in my nose, my throat, everywhere. I found my way back to the camp, grabbed the water jug, and went back to rinse off as best I could. Ice-cold water on raw skin made me yell into the trees, breath coming in gasps. I used it anyway, splashing, scrubbing, trying to erase what had just happened. There wasn't enough water in the jug to do it properly. Not even close, but I did what I could. By the time I crawled back into the tent, I felt hollow, empty, shaking and nauseous and humiliated. I pulled off my outer layer and curled back into the bag, trying to stop shaking. I didn't sleep, just stared at the tent fabric for hours until the light changed. The next morning was still cold, but the wind had died. The forest looked calm and peaceful in the early sun. She unzipped the tent, stretched, and got to work making coffee. I sat there for a while, silent, just watching the steam from the pot curl into the air. She pointed out a pouch in one of the crates. I'd seen it the night before, tossed it aside while looking for the shovel. That pouch held a collapsible trowel, bright orange handle, lightweight, sharp little edge, perfect for digging into hard ground. The one she'd meant to pack all along. I'd used the wrong shovel. I didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there with my coffee, feeling the dirt under my fingernails, the rawness in my legs, the grime I hadn't gotten completely off. I kept thinking about the hole, too shallow, too close, too messy. I thought about animals maybe digging it up, about how fast things could go wrong in the woods, how fragile everything felt when your body turns on you. We stayed another night, but I barely moved from camp. My stomach was better, but the memory stuck to me like the dirt on my skin. The next morning, we packed up, hiked out, and drove home in silence most of the way. That trip didn't kill camping for me. I've gone again since, but I pack the shovel myself now. I check it, test it, and I always know exactly where it is. I triple-check the toilet paper, and I never underestimate the difference between comfort and disaster out in the woods. Because sometimes it doesn't take a storm or a predator or a fall down a cliff. Sometimes it just takes the wrong shovel at the wrong time, and a stomach you thought you could trust.